Is not over, because there is still a pretty major diplomatic event which takes place right at the end of 1812, on the 30th of December, when essentially the Prussians under General York basically thinks, is this really worth it? And he decides, off his own bat, to go into negotiations with the Russians. He sends a message to the king, obviously, because he has to inform the king what he's decided to do. The chief Russian negotiators are General Hans Karl von Diebitsch, who is a German in Russian service, and he's been serving as Wittgenstein's chief of staff. And he is joined by Karl von Clausewitz. He and York were essentially on the same page, but yeah. Let's not beat around the bush. What York has done here is treason. The king basically asks York to essentially come back at once and get court-martialed. And York's just like, no. He sort of lingers on for a bit until the situation develops, which I think is a fair play to him, because the situation does develop, and we now have a Russo-Prussian alliance and the Sixth Coalition. So we've got the Swedes, we've got the Russians, we got the Prussians, and where are the British? I think it probably took a while for them to complete the third part of the triangle. Obviously, yeah, at this point, Wellington is now advancing.
In 1812, he smashes the French at Salamanca, takes Madrid in triumph, rides into fanfares and women throwing flowers at his feet and stuff like that, and he spends a lovely time there, then loses his mind and goes and throws himself at a pathetic little place called Burgos without a proper siege train. Soult comes bearing down at him, fails to take it, he runs back, pretty much abandoning everything he's taken all the way back to Portugal.
Back to Portugal, basically.
But the damage is done. In 1813, the French melt in front of him as he comes back. He crushes them at Victoria, and the French, it's just not possible to maintain anything there anymore.
And this victory was celebrated by Ludwig van Beethoven composing Wellington's Victory, or the Battle Symphony, which is one of Beethoven's worst yet most lucrative compositions.
Wellington would have reached Paris by probably the end or middle of 1814. Yeah,
he's by around sort of 1813, 1814, he's sort of fighting across the Pyrenees in southwestern France. We now go back to Central Europe, which is the major theatre of 1813. So the Russians and Prussians have concluded the Treaty of Kalisz, and at this point, the French are still trying to sort of fall back on a defensible line. So essentially, they're abandoning like large parts of Poland to the Russo-Prussian alliance, and indeed parts of Germany. This is when the Duchy of Warsaw kind of stops being a thing. And then we hit a bit of a break in progress, because old Kutuzov, he's now 68. He's fallen ill, and he dies at the end of April the 26th. But so now you've got Piotr Wittgenstein in command of this allied army. So the Prussians are commanded by Blücher, the Russians are commanded by Wittgenstein, who's also the commander of the whole allied army. When the Allies meet with Napoleon for the first grand clash of the 1813 campaign, which is at Lutzen. By this point, Napoleon's already come back. He's managed to get an army. He's managed to recruit essentially 1 million people. But it takes time to train horses. It takes time to train riders. And you also need to be able to find horses. And so Napoleon, he has a massive army, but he lacks cavalry badly. So we get to Lutzen on the 1st of May, I believe. And essentially what happens, it's a very bloody fight, but Napoleon manages to win a tactical victory. Both sides lose around 20,000 men. And it's considered Napoleon's victory, but he cannot pursue the Allies effectively because he has no horses. It's far from disastrous. They live to fight on another day. They actually fight another battle not too far away at Bautzen a couple of weeks later, and again the Allies are defeated, but Napoleon doesn't manage to rediscover his mojo to some extent with his back against the wall. But the problem is essentially the lack of cavalry, which means you can't convert a victory on the battlefield to a rout. The Russians and Prussians they try better to keep together. And we should just mention our good friend Barclay de Tolly is back.
Oh, good.
And essentially, Wittgenstein he recognizes that he is not experienced enough at this point to command such a large army. So he petitions the Tsar, and the Tsar is around at headquarters. And he basically says, please, can I relinquish my command? Unfortunately, Barclay doesn't actually manage to do much fighting as commander-in-chief of the Allied armies, because this is the point where we have a truce. The Allies have had a bit of a setback, and they want the Austrians to join them. Metternich basically says, well, I'm not going to join you straight away, but let's negotiate. Let's have a peace. Let me talk to Napoleon, and let's see what we can get. So Metternich tries to negotiate with Napoleon, and I think he basically says, you can keep quite a lot of stuff, and certainly keeping some stuff, certainly to the Rhine, but also some stuff beyond it, I believe. And that's actually a fairly good deal. But Napoleon thinks he can do better, so he rejects the Austrian mediation out of hand, and he says that he's going to fight. And at this stage, Metternich just threatens him and says, if you're going to fight, then we're going to join the Sixth Coalition. Napoleon's just like, fine. From this point on, things kind of go a bit downhill, because not only do the Allies have a large number of men who are, we can probably say, actually better trained and better quality than Napoleon's army. And what we can say about the Allies also is they have a plan. They come up with a plan called the Trachenberg Plan, which essentially means when you see Napoleon, run away from him. When you see any of his marshals, fight them. Once Austria has joined the coalition, Barclay is no longer Allied commander. This now passes on to Schwarzenberg. And this is mainly the result of Alexander being a diplomat and recognizing that without the Austrians on side, and knowing that the Austrians are rather reluctant, that you're not going to get far with them. So you have to keep the Austrians as part of the coalition. And so altogether, it's maybe like 400,000, maybe more. The other major development was that rather than sort of keeping like Austrians and Russians and Prussians separate, they're all amalgamated into these commands. So this means that rather than beforehand when Napoleon manages to defeat the Prussians, and then they decide to seek terms. Now you're sort of mitigating the risk, but unfortunately, having won the Battle of Dresden rather impressively, Napoleon couldn't capitalize on the victory. He sent a corps under General Van Damme to pursue, I think it was the Russians, because they were the rear guard. And then somehow the pursuers became the pursued, and Van Damme was cut off and routed at the Battle of Kulm. So we've got that, and also around the same time, you've got the battle of the Katzbach, where Blucher's army of Silesia manages to defeat a fairly sizable French force under Marshal MacDonald, and yeah, we get to Leipzig. It's a four-day battle. What I say is that actually initially things don't go too badly for Napoleon. General Poniatowski at this point does very well, and because he does very well, by the end of the day he's promoted to marshal. But then things start
unraveling.
Start unraveling.
Yeah, there's not enough room. There's too many men, and it comes down to bridges again, unbelievably.
Yes.
He's trapped against a river, which is something that he should have remembered the Russians tried to avoid in 1812. And it's a big disaster in the end, isn't it? And
it's a rather calamitous retreat. The bridges get destroyed too early once again, and unlike at Berezino, where you could make the argument that fine, the rest of them weren't getting out anyway, there were still men trying to get through. Among them, Prince Poniatowski, Marshal Poniatowski, the rearguard commander, and the bridge is gone, so he has to try to swim across the River Elster. At this point, he's already rather heavily wounded, and he doesn't make it, and he drowns. That, unfortunately, is the end of the three-day marshal. I should also mention Davout, who is at Hamburg. He's basically been tasked with, I think he's a garrison of like 20,000 to 25,000 men at Hamburg, and pretty hold on, no matter what. And to be fair to Davout, he manages to do that, throughout the entire campaign. But one of the big what ifs is, what if Davout had been on the field rather than hold up in Hamburg? Whether he would have managed to make...
Always the what if, isn't it? Even with Waterloo, it's, if only Davout had been there.
Right.
As if he was like some sort of a prophet.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, I don't think it would have changed a lot. Because the numerical odds were just so large against Napoleon. And the Allies now knew what they were doing. And even if they ran into fierce resistance against Davout, I mean, to be fair, Davout was probably like holding up like 60,000 allies, so that was probably enough of a contribution. So Leipzig is where Napoleon's force is. That's sort of completely shifted the momentum.
Yeah, he can no longer basically campaign outside of France, essentially speaking. It's what it means. It doesn't happen instantly. Nothing happens instantly. But it means basically next year he's in France, basically. Has to defend France.
So I guess we just go very quickly in 1814 when Napoleon tries to, he's essentially trying to defend France, and he thinks that he can, like the Russians defended Russia with the sort of, with the patriotic spirit and things like that. He thinks that
the miracles of the Republic will happen again.
Right. He thinks that again. He has to basically recruit
another army,
mainly from the National Guard and militia and that sort of stuff. Very fresh troops, not particularly well trained. But he believes that the Elan is going to get them through, at least to be able to defend France and defend Paris.
Mm.
I don't think he has any sort of thoughts of conquest, and frankly, I think he would probably bite Metternich's hand off for the offer he had been.
Even half the offer.
Right, exactly. But what instead we get is essentially Napoleon on the back foot, desperately back against the wall, trying to save France.
He tries his best to dart at them.
He tries his best, and the army of Bohemia and the army of Silesia and the army of the North all converge basically against France's northeastern border, and then go down towards Paris. Meanwhile, you've got Wellington sort of penetrating through the Pyrenees.
France now,
yeah. So
Toulouse and things like that.
Right, but it's still northeastern France, which is the focus. And it's where Napoleon is. Blucher's army of Silesia has actually managed to make some decent progress, and it's the momentum driving the Allied forces towards Paris. Without him, the Allies would not have gone too quickly, and Tsar Alexander was already sort of hectoring Schwarzenberg to get a move on. And this is Napoleon's 6 Day Campaign, where he essentially wins a series of fairly minor engagements against units of Blucher's army, and it's successful. And his idea is, you may expect the army of Bohemia to move into Paris, but he's thinking like a Russian.
Yeah.
And he's thinking, let them take Paris as long as my army is intact. We can still fight on. That doesn't really work.
But it's another fine display of generalship again. Under pressure.
He is helped by the fact that Blucher has an absolute mental breakdown.
Yes.
And he believes at this point that a French soldier has impregnated him with an elephant, and he is about to give birth to an elephant.
Yeah. And, so basically, he's just been fighting too much, and that's all we can say about that.
I mean, he's not exactly the sanest of generals to start with, but he has completely lost it by this point.
Yeah.
And I believe it's General von der Ostensacken, the Russian, who essentially deputizes on his behalf. That's one of the reasons why the army of Silesia doesn't fight as well as maybe it could have done if Blucher were at any sort of stage of lucidity.
But despite Napoleon's energetic campaign to try and numb basically the Allies by lightning strikes,
it doesn't work because, and then this is when I think the Russians basically take matters into their own hands, and Barclay and Raevsky and some of the senior Russian generals just basically say, let's just send 30,000 men to Paris and see what happens.
Yeah. And, anybody else? Yeah. You want to go to Paris? Anybody?
And meanwhile, the army of Bohemia, I think, is trying to actually chase Napoleon, make their way to Paris. They fight a battle at Montmartre. And this is when, I believe, Marmont capitulates.
Yes, it's the mutiny of the marshals, basically. They domino after Marmont.
So Marmont's the first to negotiate, and that's why he's considered the traitor.
Yeah. And then the rest of them just sort of all go, well, it's over really, guys, isn't it?
And obviously, Napoleon, once he realizes this, he tries to go back to Paris.
Does.
But the game is up.
Yeah, he's confronted. I mean, he loses the control of the army. He has the famous showdown with Ney and everybody, who basically tell him it's over.
It's over, sir. And that's the end of Napoleon.
Some say that's the legitimate end of Napoleon. Yeah, he is faced with no choice. He signs abdication. He promises to go quietly
to the night.
But the morning comes faster than everybody expected.
Yes. And at this time, the Congress of Vienna is going, which again is something that can take like 4 to 5 episodes to talk about. And
France is in turmoil because nobody's happy with Louis, even though they don't really want Napoleon back, despite what some people say. And that is the opportunity for this madman who thinks somehow he can manage to undo what has been done, to return, invades France, pulls it off.
But of course, this has already been covered in far greater detail in your video series with Marcus Cribb.
That is where the Napoleonic story ends. With second exile on Saint Helena, where he eventually dies. And again, another benchmark has been reached, and that is, but in great part, that was made possible because the Russians defeated him in 1812, and I suppose fairly to say that the British had continued a 6-year campaign in Spain.
Right. Certainly, both Russia and Spain had a lot to do with Napoleon's demise. But you could probably argue that Russia was more important because Napoleon lost more men and lost more horses and so on.
It accelerated what seemed to be happening. And because it put Russia at the center, essentially, of the coalition, allowed them to exert that experience and diplomatic and political clout they had achieved by being the first one to really land one on Napoleon to drive things forward. Yes, 1812 is the year of misery for Napoleon, whether it's both in Spain, but especially Russia. Yes, it's because of the invasion of Russia that essentially everything
collapses. You've got weaknesses in the structure before that, but Russia is where the house completely collapses. Napoleon tries to rebuild it a couple of times and fails to do so because by now all the momentum was with the Allies, and they now have the unity of purpose with Alexander at the top. And the Austrians and Prussians certainly played their part.
They did.
But
a lot of it, we should also say, a lot of it was funded by the British.
Yeah.
That actually is the main contribution, militarily speaking.
In Central Europe, there's some rockets.
Yeah.
There's some rockets, and
their contribution is money and Wellington, because Wellington was a big boon morale-wise.
I think it was certainly, even in 1812, the Russians hearing about stuff in Spain certainly provided a boost to morale for the Russian army, and this would have continued on in 1813 when Wellington.
He went to Vienna for a reason. He was sent to Vienna for a reason, basically. Right. Everybody knew of Wellington. Everyone wanted to shake his hand.
Yeah.
Tsar Alexander has a moment in 1815 where Wellington is about to leave for Brussels, and supposedly takes him by the shoulders and does his Alexander thing, where he goes, "It is now up to you to save the world again." Now, at the one hand, it sounds completely unlike Alexander, because obviously he knows he saved the world. But on the other hand, it sounds exactly like Alexander, because just as he said farewell to Barclay at Vilna, Barclay knew this already, but he wanted to tell him.
I think you could question his diplomacy at Vienna itself, but certainly when it came to keeping the coalition together, he had a major role in doing so. The driving force, that in the end is what did for him.